Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something often left out of history books, something quiet, intimate, uncomfortable, and deeply human. Sex. Not the dramatic kind you hear about in scandalous stories of Henry VIII or scheming queens, but the real kind, the boring kind, the kind that happened behind wool curtains, under damp linen sheets, in wooden bed frames, shared with children, in-laws, and sometimes fleas. Tonight's journey takes us to Tudor England, a world of silence, of ritual, of deep shame and strange beliefs. And though the topic is heavy, we'll move through it slowly, gently, like a candle flickering its way through the corridors of a crooked old house. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften. Pull the blankets a little closer. You don't need to remember any of this. You're just here to listen, to rest, to drift, and if sleep finds you before we finish, that's perfectly all right. Let's begin. Let us begin quietly. With the body. The Tudor body, though made of flesh and bone just like ours, was seen and felt very differently. Its meanings were layered, its functions mysterious, and its rules not dictated by science, but by something older, something much more elemental. Imagine waking up in a cold, thatch-roofed room sometime around the year 1540. The smell of wood smoke hangs faintly in the air. Beneath your scratchy woolen blanket, your limbs feel stiff. There is no such thing as a warm bath waiting, no modern mirror to examine your reflection, no comforting notion of health as you know it. Instead, you begin your day believing that your body is a vessel controlled by four invisible fluids. The humours. The humours were ancient, long before the Tudors, long before England. But they had been passed down, unquestioned, refined by Galen and Hippocrates, and now made doctrine by priests, physicians, and midwives alike. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Each fluid had its temperament. Blood was warm and moist, like youth. Phlegm was cold and sluggish. Yellow bile burned with hot, dry anger. Black bile brooded, cold, dry, melancholic. You were told that your unique mix of these fluids dictated who you were. Whether you were loud or quiet, sweet or bitter, fertile or barren. And above all else, these humours shaped your sex. The male body was thought to be hotter, more forceful, more active. His humours were bold, his nature dry, upright, rational. The female body, by contrast, was cold and damp, thought to be passive, unpredictable, and deeply tied to the mysterious pull of the moon. Even this idea, that women were moved by lunar tides, was not questioned. The monthly cycle was seen as both proof of her instability and her connection to divine rhythms. But it was not sacred. It was not celebrated. It was feared, pitied, even ridiculed. And so, from the first breath of life, your body was not entirely your own. It was interpreted, managed, explained away by humours, by sin, by signs. Let's walk slowly now into the life of a common woman. She is not noble, not rich. She might be 27, but her face is already lined from sun, wind, and childbearing. Her body, softened by labour and too many pregnancies, is not hers in the modern sense. She has never been taught to listen to it. Instead, she listens to the midwife, to the herbalist, to the priest, and all of them agree. Her flesh is governed by imbalance. She bleeds, they say, because her womb must purge impurities. She must be careful. Too much heat, too much movement, too many emotions, and the blood will turn poisonous. Women who spoke too freely, who wept too long, were said to be suffering from suffocation of the womb, a strange hysteria believed to rise from the uterus and cloud the brain. So she stays quiet. She walks barefoot in the kitchen, stirring the same pot of pottage, listening for the creak of her husband's boots on the threshold. If he is pleased with her, he may share her bed that night. If not, she may sleep alone or not at all. But desire is not something she speaks of. That belongs to men. Tudor men were encouraged to see themselves as ruled by passion, not the romantic kind, but something more physical. Lust was normal, natural, but it was also dangerous. If a man released his seed too often, or worse, with himself alone, he was told it would weaken his spirit, drain his strength, make him sick. So he must be careful. He must marry. He must spill his seed only with purpose, and even then, only when the moon was right. Too much sex, they warned, would cause blindness, swelling of the spleen, or worse, melancholy. You see, sex was not casual. It was medicinal. It was spiritual. It was tied to food, to weather, to herbs and prayers and unseen forces. And so, when a husband came to his wife's bedside, he might do so after eating boiled nettle or powdered beetroot or a warm posset of ale and cinnamon, all thought to stir the blood and ready the body. And she, if she was wise, would have taken pennyroyal tea that morning, not because she wished to displease him, but because she already had 3 children and could not bear another. She might whisper a prayer under her breath as he climbed into bed, one hand on her crucifix, the other clenching the sheet. This was not seduction, this was survival. Even the act itself, that private moment between 2 people, was not understood as private at all. It was monitored by belief, law, and community. There were rules. You could not lie together on a feast day, nor during Lent, nor on Sundays, nor when the wife was menstruating, nor during a new moon, nor if either of you had eaten too much onion or drunk too much ale. Some believed that if the wife lay on her left side after intercourse, she would conceive a girl. If she rolled to the right, a boy. And though science had nothing to say about this, midwives did, and so did mothers and priests and gossiping neighbors. In towns and villages, women talked in whispers about blood, about pain, about sex, but never in public, never loudly, never in a way that made them seem too curious or too knowing. To be a woman who enjoyed sex was to be suspicious. A woman too interested in her own body might be called wanton. A woman who spoke too much of fertility or herbs might be accused of witchcraft. A woman who bled irregularly or not at all might be called cursed. And yet sex was still expected, not for love, but for duty. Marriages were often arranged to secure land, wealth, or social standing. The wedding night, that supposed moment of sacred union, was often awkward, painful, and surrounded by witnesses. Some families insisted on the bedding ceremony, a public ritual where guests walked the couple to their shared bed, watched them undress, and then left the room with smirks and jokes, trusting or hoping that the marriage would be consummated properly. Sometimes they didn't leave at all. There are documented cases of lords and ladies being observed, yes, watched, during their first night together to prove the deed was done. Not for pleasure, for politics. If the bride failed to bleed, if the sheets did not show the expected red mark, questions were asked. Was she already spoiled? Was the groom impotent? Was the union valid? The body, again, was not a private vessel. It was public property. And so the Tudor world spun on, full of misbelief, ritual, and quiet endurance. A world where sex was something done, not something felt. A world where the body was something to fear, not to know. And still, despite the fear, the rules, the shame, people touched, people kissed, people longed. They found each other in the shadows of barns, beneath the rafters of alehouses, in the back pews of quiet chapels. They exchanged glances across muddy courtyards and passed love notes tucked into baskets of apples, because no amount of church law or herbal warning could erase the most basic human need, the need for closeness, for touch, for connection. Some, of course, suffered more than others. A noblewoman might be taught to read, and through books find glimpses of poetry, of yearning. A milkmaid, by contrast, might know only the touch of a hand and the ache of regret. A merchant's son might woo his bride with sugar and velvet, while a tenant farmer's wife might go years without a single gentle word. Still, across the countryside, under smoke-grey skies, life moved forward. Children were born. Many died. Women aged quickly. Men fell silent with sorrow. And through it all, the body endured. The four humours remained the map by which they navigated sickness, desire, madness, and love. Physicians might poke and prod and bleed a patient who showed signs of imbalance. They might prescribe boiled frogs for impotence, or figs and goat's milk for a frigid wife. But rarely did anyone ask what it felt like. Rarely did anyone ask if sex brought joy, or connection, or comfort. Because in Tudor England, the body was not yours. It belonged to your husband, your priest, your midwife, your king. And sex, like prayer, like bread, like breath, was part of the order of things. Not to be questioned, only endured. And yet, as we sit here now, 500 years later, with blankets pulled close and lamps burning low, we can begin to see the outlines of something deeper. We can imagine the unspoken thoughts behind tired eyes, the secret longings buried beneath layers of wool and linen, the tiny rebellions carried out in silence, the wife who turned away and feigned sleep, the girl who whispered to her friend about a boy at the market, the young man who closed his eyes and thought of someone else entirely. The truth is, sex in Tudor England was rarely joyful, rarely free, but it was always human, always complicated, always quiet. And in that quiet, we begin to understand the world they lived in, a world where the body was a mystery, where touch was tangled in belief, and where the simple act of desiring someone could carry weight for a lifetime. Tonight, we honor that silence. We breathe slowly with it, and we let the candle burn low as the story unfolds. Let us return now to the Tudor world, with its slow mornings and creaking floors, where time drifted gently between bells and seasons, and where the human body, that soft, sweating, aching thing, was not always welcome company. If we're to understand why sex was such a strange and uncomfortable part of daily life in Tudor England, we must first understand something even more basic. Water, or rather, the lack of it. Today, the idea of stepping into a hot shower, steam curling around your skin, clean towels waiting just beyond the curtain, it seems natural, expected. But for most people living in England between the late 1400s and early 1600s, the idea of full-body bathing was unfamiliar, risky, and often avoided. Let's sit now in a quiet Tudor cottage, its walls thick with wattle and daub, the hearth still warm from last night's fire. There is no plumbing, no sink, no soap in the modern sense. What you have instead is a small, shallow basin, perhaps made of wood, perhaps tin. The water drawn from a well, cold, cloudy, heavy with minerals. Washing, if done at all, was usually partial. A cloth dipped in water, then wrung out carefully. The face, the hands, maybe the neck, the rest, left to God. Because bathing, in the way we think of it, immersion in water, soaking away sweat and dirt, had fallen out of favor long before the Tudor age. The great public bathhouses that had dotted medieval cities were now gone, shuttered or demolished after waves of plague and fear. Too many had come to associate hot baths with immorality, with sickness, with sin. Some blamed the sweating sickness, a mysterious, deadly fever that struck without warning, on the reopening of old bathhouses. Others whispered of syphilis, or the French pox as it was then known, spreading through damp rooms and shared basins, and so water was feared, heat was feared, nakedness was feared. Cleanliness, as the Tudors understood it, was not about water, it was about appearance, smell, modesty, order. To be clean was to wear fresh linen against the skin, to change one's undergarments regularly, perhaps every few days if you were lucky, or once a week if you were not. The linen absorbed the sweat and oil. The outer garments, gowns, jerkins, cloaks, were rarely washed at all. You might hang them by the fire to dry, you might dust them with crushed rosemary or sprigs of lavender, but wash them. That was dangerous. Water could shrink or warp wool, loosen seams, rot delicate fabrics. Better to leave it be. And so the human body carried its own story. A story told through scent, through texture, through layers of linen and wool. Imagine a man returning home after a day in the fields. His hands are thick with dirt, his collar stained with sweat. He wipes his face with the back of his sleeve and removes his doublet, revealing a yellowed shirt beneath. His wife brings a cloth and a small bowl of water, warmed slightly near the hearth. He sits on a stool as she wipes his face, his neck, the back of his ears. It is not romantic, it is ritual, a gesture of care perhaps, or simply obligation. He does not bathe. She does not ask him to. Because full bathing in the tub was rare, reserved for the sick, the very rich, or the very brave. If a person did choose to bathe, truly bathe, it was an ordeal. First, the water had to be drawn, heated slowly over fire in great iron pots, then poured into a wooden tub. The tub itself was often placed near the hearth, both for warmth and for privacy. But even in the grandest homes, privacy was a luxury. The bath might be shared, first by the father, then the mother, then the children, then the baby, last of all. By the time it reached the younger ones, the water was cold and cloudy. And sometimes there were lice. Soap was made at home or purchased in hard, lumpy cakes. It was coarse, made of animal fat and lye. The kindest soaps came from Castile, imported and expensive. Most people used what they could afford. Harsh, gritty, pungent. For hair, there was no shampoo. Instead, ashes and vinegar, sometimes crushed herbs, sometimes eggs. Hair was rarely washed with water. Instead, it was combed, powdered, and oiled. Head coverings helped, coifs for women, felt hats for men, both to keep dirt out and to keep lice hidden. And so, as you might imagine, the body was not always a welcoming place. Skin chafed. Hair grew wild. Teeth were cleaned with cloth and soot or crushed sage. Underarms were dusted with powdered herbs. Mouths rinsed with wine or ale. Perfume existed, but only for the rich. It was made with oils, resins, and rare flowers. A tiny bottle might cost more than a week's wages. Instead, most people relied on nature, time, marjoram, rue-dried flowers tucked into pockets, linen sachets hung in cupboards, beds stuffed with straw and lavender, and still the smell lingered. The smell of people, of work, of animals, of fire. This was the world into which sex stepped, not into cleanliness, but into closeness. And closeness in a body so rarely washed was complicated. Let us picture now a wedding night. The couple has eaten a simple meal, perhaps bread, cheese, cold goose, stewed plums. Ale was served. The bride has been weeping quietly, her hands shaking in her lap. The groom is nervous too, but determined. They are led to the bedchamber by family members, some of whom linger far too long, offering bawdy jokes and songs. Finally alone, the young couple undresses, slowly, awkwardly. The room is cold. There is no fire. Their bodies are shy, pale, covered in bruises, blemishes, scars. They do not speak much. They do not laugh. He is expected to take the lead. She is expected to submit. There is no such thing as foreplay. No knowledge of arousal, only duty. The bed itself is rough. A wooden frame filled with ropes, topped by a straw mattress. Sheets are made of coarse linen. They scratch. They smell of starch and dust. Outside, someone might be listening. Sometimes a midwife or elder relative waits for proof of consummation, to inspect the sheets, to hear the sounds, to report satisfaction. And even if the act is gentle, it is rarely comfortable. Because when bodies are unwashed, when skin is chafed, when shame surrounds every movement, intimacy becomes something to endure, not enjoy. Of course, there were exceptions. There were marriages filled with affection, even tenderness. Letters survive, quiet, yearning, poetic, between spouses separated by war or politics. A man might write to his wife, "I long for your touch as I do for bread." A woman might confess in careful script, "Your arms are the only place I sleep soundly." But even these rare glimpses do not suggest pleasure as we know it. Rather, they speak to closeness, comfort, relief from loneliness. Because in a world where the body was always heavy with labor, where pain was constant and privacy rare, touch itself was a luxury, a kind word, a soft hand, a warm embrace. These were treasures. Sex, meanwhile, was burdened with expectation, to make heirs, to bind marriages, to fulfill scripture, and cleanliness was never part of the equation. Those who could afford it might bathe more often. Wealthy noblewomen were sometimes painted in bath scenes, posed delicately in tubs, surrounded by attendants. But these were fantasies, idealized images. Most real baths, even for the rich, were infrequent. Queen Elizabeth I was said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. More commonly, ladies had their bodies washed by servants with warm cloths and scented water. Even then, it was partial, selective. The face, the hands, the private parts, only when needed. And for men, the situation was no better. Soldiers returned from campaigns with lice, boils, and trench rot. Laborers wore the same clothes for weeks. Merchants traveled for days without washing, their boots filled with sweat. When they returned to their wives or mistresses, there was no expectation of perfume or softness or preparation. Just bodies, raw, immediate, imperfect. It's important to remember, though, that the Tudors did not think of themselves as dirty. They believed they were managing their bodies in the best way possible. Clean linen, herbal washes, avoidance of dangerous baths. Their idea of health came not from soap, but from balance, the right foods, the right sleep, the right moral conduct. Even physicians warned against overbathing. They believed that opening the pores with warm water allowed sickness to enter, that washing too often made one vulnerable to bad air, or worse, bad thoughts. Because nakedness itself was suspicious. It invited sin, it provoked desire, it weakened the will, and so the body was kept hidden, even from oneself. Mirrors were rare. Most people saw only a vague reflection in dark glass or polished metal. They did not study their pores. They did not examine their thighs. They looked at their hands, cracked, reddened, and got back to work. So when we think about sex in Tudor England, we must place it within this context. Not the romantic glow of candlelight, but the creak of ropes weakness under a straw mattress, the ache of muscles after a day in the fields, the quick, muted sigh of a woman trying not to wake the baby beside her. Sex was something squeezed into the edges of life. Between chores, between prayers, between pregnancies, and the body was a stubborn vessel. It itched, it oozed, it bled, it carried lice and pain and sorrow, and yet it endured. Tudor people endured. They found ways to survive, to love, to rest. Some nights a woman might soak her feet in warm water laced with chamomile, her husband rubbing her shoulders quietly. Some days a man might carry a flower in his pocket just to smell something sweet while he worked. They cared for their bodies in ways that made sense to them, through touch, through ritual, through silence. Not because they didn't want more, but because they didn't know more existed. And still the body remained a source of wonder. A child's heartbeat, the softness of a lover's hair, the relief of cool cloth on a fevered brow. These too were part of the story. So when we say that baths were for the rich and the very brave, we are not mocking the Tudors. We are honoring their quiet resilience, their ability to live with discomfort, to find beauty in simplicity, to love, even when it was inconvenient. They walked through muddy streets, wore heavy wool in summer, shared beds with siblings and strangers, and yet they loved, they touched, they longed, just as we do. And maybe, just maybe, that's all the proof we need, that the body, no matter how chapped or sore, still remembers how to reach for another. Even in the cold, even in silence, even without soap, let us return slowly now to the edge of a celebration, a Tudor wedding. It is evening. The candles are burning low. Outside, the sun has already vanished behind the trees, and the scent of summer hangs in the air. Bread, damp grass, ale, sweat, and rose petals trodden into the earth. Somewhere nearby, the church bell is echoing faintly through the village lanes. And in a timber-framed hall, filled with laughter and music, a bride and groom sit side by side, quiet, smiling tightly, as relatives gather around them with full cups and teasing eyes. Tonight is not simply a night of joy. It is an obligation, and it will not end when the dancing stops. Because for newlyweds in Tudor England, the wedding night wasn't just personal, it wasn't private. It wasn't in the modern sense theirs. It was something witnessed, inspected, spoken of loudly and without shame, not by the couple, but by everyone around them. To marry in Tudor England was not merely a spiritual or emotional act. It was a legal contract, a social binding, and most importantly, it was not considered complete, not fully legitimate, until it had been physically consummated. Sex, in the eyes of church and law, was what transformed a union from symbolic to real. But how could anyone be certain it had taken place? Well, someone had to watch, or listen, or check the bedsheets. The ceremony itself may have been simple. A walk to the church, a muttered exchange of vows before the priest, rings, if they could be afforded, a quick prayer, a blessing. Then came the feast, simple or elaborate, depending on status. Ale flowed, music played, a roasted pig if you were lucky, maybe berries soaked in honey, laughter, dancing, the flicker of torchlight and the rustle of skirts. But always, at the end, the bedding. To us, the word might conjure something soft, romantic, a dim room with firelight flickering on the wall. But in Tudor life, the bedding was both event and performance. Guests would gather around the couple, sometimes dozens of them, and sing songs, chant rhymes, shout advice. Some would guide the bride and groom to the chamber, others would wait by the door. A few, in noble households, might enter the room itself. The bride's garments would be slowly removed, not by her husband, but by her maids or older women. sometimes her mother, sometimes the midwife. Her hair, if braided, would be loosened, her shoes removed, her chemise pulled over her head with shaking hands. The groom, likewise, might be stripped by his groomsmen, his hose unfastened, his shirt lifted, all of it done with laughter, with mockery, with barely disguised scrutiny. And then, once the couple had been placed into bed, the curtains pulled around them, the room would empty. Maybe. Because not everyone left. In noble homes, especially where land and legacy were at stake, witnesses might remain in the room to observe the consummation, or at least to stay close enough to hear. The logic was simple. If intrusive, a marriage unconsummated could be annulled. If there was no sex, there was no union, and so the event had to be confirmed. Sometimes this meant checking the bed sheets the next morning, looking for the telltale bloodstain that would prove the bride's virginity. Sometimes it meant listening for sounds. Occasionally it meant staying in the room, a practice more common among royals and the upper nobility. For the average villager, things were simpler, but still public. Gossip moved quickly. If a husband left the bed too soon or a bride showed no signs of discomfort the next morning, people talked. They whispered behind shutters, they speculated in church pews, and always, the burden of proof fell on the woman. Because Tudor society was built on assumptions about the female body, assumptions that were both medically flawed and morally rigid. A virgin, they believed, must bleed. The hymen was seen not as a thin membrane of variable shape, but as a guaranteed sign. If blood was absent, something was wrong. The bride had lied. She had sinned. She had deceived her husband and his family. Never mind that many women do not bleed. Never mind that hard labor, riding horses, or even years of physical work could affect the body. These facts were not known, or if known, not acknowledged. And so women approached the wedding night with fear. Some, it's believed, secretly pricked their fingers and stained the sheets themselves, desperate to avoid shame, or worse. Others were too naive to know what to expect. Mothers often withheld information, fearing scandal. The girl might not even know what would happen. She might lie there in the dark, trembling, waiting for her husband, a man she might barely know, to lift her shift and do what was expected. All the while praying it would be over quickly, praying that the pain would pass, praying that she would bleed enough to satisfy everyone else. For the groom, too, there was pressure. He was expected to perform, to prove his masculinity. If he failed, due to nerves, alcohol, fear, or inexperience, the consequences could be serious. Rumors of impotence could ruin a man's reputation. If he could not consummate the marriage, it could be annulled, and with it, all hopes of inheritance, alliance, or status. Some grooms sought herbal remedies. Others drank mixtures of wine and honey, or rubbed their bodies with warming salves. Superstitions surrounded the act, charms placed under pillows, prayers whispered under breath, tokens hidden in bedposts. In one recorded case, a Tudor groom was so anxious that he sought a local cunning woman, a folk healer, who gave him a dried toad's tongue to carry in his pocket. It didn't help. What did help sometimes was time and kindness. Some couples did find comfort with each other, even love. Not all wedding nights were disasters. Letters survive of men praising their wives' gentleness, of women describing quiet tenderness. But these are rare. More often the wedding night was remembered with silence, not spoken of again. And it didn't end with the first night. Consummation had to be regular, enough to produce heirs, especially among noble families. If a wife didn't conceive within the first year, people began to worry. Questions were asked, midwives called, herbalists consulted, and once again it was often the woman who bore the blame. Was her womb cold? Was her blood unbalanced? Was she being punished by God? The husband's role, if questioned at all, was secondary. Male infertility wasn't understood, and if suspected, rarely admitted. In desperate cases, couples were examined, their bodies prodded, their behaviors studied, their sheets inspected, and if it was deemed that consummation had never truly occurred, they could be separated, sent back to their families, declared never truly married. For the church, the bed was sacred, but not because of love, because of duty. Marriage was, above all, for procreation. Sex outside of marriage was a sin, but sex within marriage, as long as it followed certain rules, was not just allowed. It was expected. Still, there were rules. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, also during Lent, also during Advent, also on feast days, fast days, and holy days. It was forbidden during a woman's menstrual cycle, forbidden if one was ill, forbidden if one had eaten garlic, forbidden too often, forbidden with too much enjoyment. And if the rules were broken, if someone confessed to excessive pleasure, or to initiating sex during the wrong phase of the moon, penance was given. So imagine two people lying in bed, married, alone, and yet never entirely free. Because the priest knew, the neighbors knew, the midwife knew, God knew, and all of them had opinions. Sex in the Tudor world was not private, not emotional, not even fully personal. It was a contract, a performance, a ritual, and the wedding night, far from being the climax of romantic love, was more often a test. Did she bleed? Did he perform? Did they obey the rules? If yes, they could move forward, begin life together, share a home, a name, a reputation. If no, the consequences echoed. Some couples stayed together in awkward truce. Some were separated. A few, a very few, found ways to redefine the union on their own terms. But for most, the script was written long before they ever met, and once the bed curtains closed, their lives became a cycle of duty. The wedding night was only the beginning, and so, as we sit here tonight, warm, safe, far from prying eyes, we can let our thoughts drift gently to those distant rooms. To the bride, heart pounding, wondering what lies ahead. To the groom, hands trembling, hoping not to fail. To the guests downstairs, raising one last cup before heading home. And to the silence of the chamber, filled with the weight of centuries. They did not have what we have. They did not know what we know. But they longed, they feared, they endured. And in their stories, told in hushed voices and faded ink, we find the truth of what it meant to be human. Even when privacy was a luxury, and love was a quiet, uncertain hope beneath the weight of tradition. Let's walk slowly now into a space that held both comfort and control. Not a home, not a bedroom, but a church. The heart of every Tudor town and village. The place where one was baptized, married, and buried. A building of thick stone, draughty aisles, and candle-lit prayers. The church was not just where people gathered for worship. It was where their lives were watched, recorded, judged. And in Tudor England, it was where sex, in all its quiet uncertainty, was most deeply bound. Because behind every kiss, every glance, every awkward moment beneath the bedsheets, stood God. Or at least, the people who spoke in his name. We often imagine the bedroom as private, a place where rules soften, where what happens is left behind closed doors. But for the Tudors, there were no truly closed doors. Every desire, every touch, every thought was threaded through with religious expectation. The church, in its towering silence, had something to say about all of it. And so, we begin here. Not with love, but with law. Not with bodies, but with sin. Sex, to the Tudor mind, was a powerful force, both necessary and dangerous. It could sanctify a marriage, or damn a soul. It could bring forth life, or attract devils. To enjoy sex too much, even within marriage, was considered suspect. To seek it for pleasure rather than procreation was edging towards sin. And for those outside the bounds of holy matrimony, the path was far more treacherous. The Church categorized sexual sin carefully, with great seriousness and often with public consequences. Fornication, adultery, incest, sodomy, even lustful thoughts could require penance. Imagine now a young man kneeling in the confessional, eyes lowered. He speaks softly. The priest listens with practiced patience. Perhaps the boy has touched himself. A word he never says aloud, only implies. Perhaps he visited a brothel near the river. Perhaps he kissed someone behind the alehouse wall. Whatever he confesses, it is recorded, advised upon, judged. Sometimes the punishment is prayer, 50 Hail Marys. Sometimes a public act of contrition, standing barefoot in the churchyard, holding a sign, "For sins of the flesh." For women, it could be worse. A maid who found herself pregnant outside of wedlock might be forced to name the father in front of the parish. If he denied it, she carried the shame alone. In towns, stocks were used. Wooden restraints set in the center square, where the accused sat for hours as villagers passed by, whispering or spitting or laughing. And yet people continued to desire, because no rule can suppress instinct forever. And in every village there were stolen glances, hidden meetings, quiet pacts between lovers, sealed with trembling hands and promises whispered in the dark. But each act, each risk was shadowed by the knowledge God is watching, and the Church is listening. The liturgical calendar, the schedule of feast and fast days, shaped not just prayers, but bodies. There were over 100 days each year when sex was forbidden. No sex on Sundays, the day of rest, none during Lent, the season of sacrifice, none during Advent in preparation for Christ's birth, none on feast days, and there were many, and never, ever during a woman's bleeding time. And so, married couples, even the most devout, spent much of the year navigating a shifting maze of no. Not now, not today, not again until Easter. But how strictly were these rules followed? That, of course, depended. Among the devout, abstinence was embraced as a virtue. Some couples even chose celibacy after producing children, dedicating themselves fully to God. Others tried to obey but found ways to bend the rules. A husband might plead with his wife. "Only tonight," he says, "God will forgive us." A wife might pretend to be ill to avoid temptation. Some carried tokens of saints believed to protect against lust. Others confessed quickly, hoping to cleanse the soul before punishment could take root. But always the fear lingered. If your child was born too soon after marriage, whispers followed. If a pregnancy ended poorly, some said it was God's retribution for lustful union. If a wife died in childbirth, which happened often, some claimed she had sinned in conceiving. And yet, the contradictions were many. The same Church that warned against desire also demanded children. Marriage was sacred, but incomplete without consummation. Wives were to be obedient, but not too eager. Husbands were to lead, but never too forcefully. It was a tightrope walk, and for those who slipped, the Church had many ways to humiliate. Court records show hundreds of ordinary people brought before ecclesiastical courts for sins of the flesh. Sometimes it was as simple as cohabiting before marriage. Other times it was adultery or bearing a child too soon. The accused were summoned, questioned, told to confess. If they lied and were found out, the punishment doubled. And what of penance? Sometimes it was mild, a fine, a few prayers, but often it was public. Imagine a woman standing at the front of the church, holding a candle, wearing a white sheet. The priest describes her sin aloud. She bows her head. She is told to return again next Sunday and the Sunday after, or a man forced to crawl on his knees from the churchyard to the altar, begging forgiveness for wanton acts. These scenes were not rare. They were reminders, warnings to others. But they did not stop desire, nor did they stop sex. They simply made it quieter, heavier, more complicated. And so, in the privacy of bedrooms, or haylofts, or quiet forests, or corners of alehouses, couples continued to meet. Some were married, some were not. Some were in love, some were simply lonely. But all of them carried the weight of belief, the weight of watching eyes, even if those eyes were imagined. The idea that sex must be regulated was not new, but in Tudor England it became doctrine, woven into sermons, etched into law, whispered by midwives and mothers alike. Some clergy were kind, others were cruel, some offered comfort, reminding parishioners that love within marriage was holy. Others thundered from the pulpit, condemning even the slightest pleasure. And yet, behind the scenes, even churchmen were human. Some priests were caught in affairs, some fathers sired illegitimate children, some monks fell into temptation, and though some were punished, cast out, excommunicated, many were quietly forgiven. Because sin in Tudor England was both public and personal, and the rules, while strict, were often applied unevenly. A wealthy merchant might pay his way out of scandal, a servant girl could not. A noblewoman might be protected by silence, a milkmaid might be dragged through the mud, literally and figuratively. The double standards ran deep, but the fear was shared by all. Even inside marriage, the rules never lifted. There were acceptable positions, acceptable times, acceptable intentions. To enjoy sex too much, even with one's spouse, was to edge toward sin. Passion must never overpower reason. Love must never become lust. And above all, one must never seek pleasure for its own sake. Because pleasure, in the theology of the day, was a dangerous thing. It led to weakness, to indulgence, to disorder, and disorder, the Tudors believed, invited chaos. Sex was a tool to be used carefully, sparingly, under supervision, and so it became yet another chore, a task to be done, a duty to be fulfilled. And yet, it remained something more. Because in the spaces between rules, people still felt, still touched, still whispered, still longed. A husband might wake before dawn, trace his wife's hand in the dark, and say nothing. A woman folding linen might remember a stolen kiss from years before and smile quietly. These were small rebellions, gentle resistances, human moments in a world of expectations. And while the church loomed large, in sermons, in punishment, in doctrine, it could not fully extinguish the private world. A world of sensation, of softness, of memory. Even priests in their quiet hours must have remembered touch, must have dreamed perhaps of warmth, because the body remembers what doctrine forgets. And so the Tudor bedroom remained a strange place, part holy site, part battlefield, part prison, part sanctuary. It was watched by the church, watched by neighbors, watched by conscience, but still, beneath all that, two people might find each other. Not easily, not freely, not always kindly, but sometimes truly. And that is perhaps the strangest thing of all. That even in a world of rules and shame, intimacy still bloomed, slowly, painfully, quietly, like a candle flickering in the farthest corner of a stone chapel. Small, faint, but real. And as we sit here tonight, letting the fire crackle, the clock tick, and the past unfold like a worn tapestry, we remember that history is not made of laws. It is made of people, of breath, of hesitation, of doubt, of hope. And even when sex was bound by scripture, there were still those who loved, awkwardly, imperfectly, completely. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that's all there ever was. Let's go gently now into the part of this story that's hardest to hold. The part behind closed shutters, behind the quiet sobbing in the corner, behind the way a woman stares just a little too long at an empty cradle. We've spoken of the church, of the rules, of beds that were not truly private. But now, we walk into the aftermath of those rules, where the price of sex was often paid, silently, by the women who bled and waited and bore alone. Because in Tudor England, sex did not end with desire. It ended in childbirth or in pain, in missed blood, in hurried prayers, in small bundles wrapped in cloth and buried under moonlight. This is a chapter of grief, quiet, soft, heavy grief, wrapped in whispers and shame. But first, let's return again to the bed. A man and a woman lie together. Perhaps they are married, perhaps not. The fire has gone out. The room is dark. The sounds of the outside world, dogs, owls, wind in the chimney, hum around them. She does not ask if he wants children. That would be strange, forward, even unseemly. And yet, if he spills inside her, she knows what it means. Maybe she hopes, maybe she dreads it. Maybe she's had 3 births already and cannot bear another. Maybe she wants nothing more than to be a mother. But it isn't her choice, not really, because for the Tudor woman, contraception, or any attempt to avoid pregnancy, was a fragile and secretive thing. A whispered knowledge passed from midwife to maiden, from herbalist to housewife, rarely written down, often punished, never guaranteed. The church opposed any method that interrupted conception. Children were seen as a gift from God. To reject them was to reject God's will. And yet, women did. Quietly, carefully, sometimes desperately. Let's walk now into a small, low-ceilinged cottage where a woman stirs herbs into boiling water, pennyroyal, rue mugwort. She does not call it medicine. She does not explain, but she drinks it quickly while her husband is out gathering firewood. She hopes it will delay her courses, or perhaps bring them on. She cannot be sure. In wealthier homes, other methods were used. Waxy pessaries made of sheep's wool soaked in vinegar, plugs of cotton dipped in salt or honey. Some tried sitting over steaming herbs or tying amulets around their thighs. A few had access to imported medicines, strange powders from Italy, thought to quiet the womb. And still pregnancies came, because most methods were uncertain, misunderstood. And the body is persistent. And so the Tudor woman lived in a state of near constant vulnerability. Each missed period could mean the beginning of joy or terror. Because pregnancy, for all its sanctity, was not a safe journey. It was a risk, a roll of the dice, a path walked with hope and fear held in equal measure. There were no scans, no blood tests, no prenatal vitamins. There was only time. The slow passage of weeks, the changes in appetite, the dreams, the nausea, the counting of days, and the watching of the moon. And then, if she was lucky, the swelling of the belly, the movement beneath the skin, the little kick that made it real. But sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes the blood came too early, or too much, or too strangely, and she would sit alone as pain gripped her, or lie on a straw mattress and feel it pass from her. A tiny, barely formed life, a clot, a whisper, a silence. She might not tell anyone, or she might tell only the midwife, or a sister, or the woman next door who had lost 3 of her own, and no one would speak of it again. Because miscarriage, like fertility, was wrapped in mystery. It was believed to be the woman's fault. Her womb was weak, her thoughts impure. She had walked too far, lifted something too heavy, eaten something too cold, or it was punishment for enjoying sex, for hiding contraception, for sinning in some forgotten way. No one knew for sure, but someone was always to blame, and that someone was usually her. Let us sit now beside her. She is lying in bed. Her hands are folded over her stomach. Her eyes are open, staring at the rafters. Her husband does not know what to say. Perhaps he is outside, chopping wood harder than he needs to. Perhaps he is praying. Perhaps he says nothing. The midwife gathers the stained linen, washes the basin, offers a soft word. Then she leaves, and the world moves on. There is no funeral, no gravestone, no lullaby, only the ache. If the woman had already picked out a name in her heart, she doesn't speak it. If she feels hollow, like something has been scooped from inside her, she does not show it. There is work to be done, the fire to stoke, the children to feed. And so she folds her grief, tucks it into the corners of her body, and keeps going. In noble households, the pain is the same, though gilded with velvet and servants and softer sheets. A lady might miscarry quietly, then be told by her physician that it was God's will, that she must try again soon. If she cannot carry a child, rumors begin. She is barren, she is cursed, she is being punished for a family sin. If she bears stillborns, and many did, she might be told to pray harder, to fast, to cleanse her womb with holy water, and if her husband grows impatient, he might seek an annulment. Because a woman who could not produce heirs was seen as a broken vessel, a failed investment, a name without continuation. Henry VIII famously had 2 wives cast aside for this very reason, though history has been far kinder to him than to them. But ordinary women had no such fame, only silence. And so they bore miscarriage after miscarriage, stillbirth after stillbirth, and returned to the loom, the kitchen, the field. Sometimes there were quiet burial rituals, a wrapped bundle placed in consecrated ground, a candle lit, a prayer whispered. Sometimes there was nothing at all, and if the baby lived, there were still dangers. Childbirth was brutal. Blood loss, infection, fever, no anesthesia, no surgical interventions, just the midwife's hands, a biting stick, and a rosary clutched in sweaty palms. Many women did not survive, and those who did often lost the child within days. Newborns were fragile, the air was cold, the milk went bad. Illness came quickly, and again it was her fault. She had not swaddled him tight enough, had not boiled the cloth, had not prayed hard enough, had angered God, and she would carry that guilt for the rest of her days. This was sex in Tudor England, not lace and perfume, but blood and hope and grief. And still, women loved. They held their swollen bellies with wonder, sang to the unborn, dreamed of names, stroked the soft heads of sleeping children, kissed scraped knees and whispered lullabies. They stitched baby gowns by candlelight, grew herbs in secret gardens, listened to the wind and wondered what it would bring. Even knowing the risks, they dared to hope. And men too grieved, though more quietly. A father might hold a tiny lifeless hand and turn away before anyone saw the tear slip down. He might plant a tree that no one understood, or carve a toy and leave it on a shelf untouched. because the grief had no language, only weight. And still, they tried again. Because in Tudor England, life was fragile. But so was joy. So was connection. So was love. Each child was a miracle, each healthy birth a triumph, each day without pain a small mercy. And behind it all, the quiet courage of women who endured, who carried, who bled and bore and rarely complained. So now, as we sit in stillness, let us remember them. Not just the queens and their royal infants, but the nameless ones. The girl who drank bitter tea to end what she could not begin. The wife who smiled through her pain so no one would worry. The mother who buried her 7th baby in the orchard and kept baking bread for the village. Their stories are not in history books, but they are everywhere, in the empty cradles and in the stains on the sheets. In the way one woman touches another's hand without needing to explain. This was the cost of sex. Not always, but often. And while the church preached duty and husbands claimed their rights and society watched with cold eyes, the real weight fell on women's shoulders, and they carried it, softly, bravely. So when we speak of Tudor love, we must speak of this too. Not just romance, but resilience. Not just marriage, but mourning. Because in a world that offered no contraception, no understanding, no safe space to weep, women still found ways to survive. And that is something sacred. Let's drift slowly now into the shadowy side of desire. A side rarely spoken of at the hearth, but always present. In the shifting glance across a tavern bench. In the coins slipped quietly into a gloved hand. In the way the skin itched days later, or the body burned with heat that prayer could not soothe. Because in Tudor England, sex was not just wrapped in rules and rituals. It was also surrounded by risk. Not just the risk of shame, or childbirth, or gossip, but the risk of disease, and not the kind you could see or understand or name clearly. No, this was a darker thing, a creeping ache in the bones, a red sore that refused to heal, a madness behind the eyes, a wasting of the body that no holy water could cure. Syphilis, or as they called it then, the French pox. It's difficult to know exactly when it arrived in England, but by the early 1500s it had taken hold. And by the time of Henry VIII it was everywhere, from the gutters of Southwark to the perfumed rooms of noble households. No one was spared, and yet no one truly understood it. The French blamed the Spanish. The Spanish blamed the Italians. The Italians blamed the French. Everyone pointed fingers. No one took responsibility. And the body, the poor vulnerable body, paid the price. Let's walk now down a London alleyway. The cobblestones are slick with rain. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and something sour beneath it. A man stumbles out of a doorway. He is not old, but his face is gaunt, his lips cracked, his eyes cloudy. He walks with a limp, not from injury, but from pain deep in the groin. His hands shake as he lights a pipe. He coughs and then disappears into the fog. No one stops him, no one asks, because they already know. The pox, it begins subtly, a sore, small and painless on the genitals. Many ignored it, thinking it would pass. Then came the rash, the fever, the aches. Then weeks or months later, lesions, open wounds, rotting flesh, hair falling out in clumps, teeth loosening in the gums, and worst of all, the madness, hallucinations, delusions, the brain eaten from within by a disease no one could name. And still, people desired. Still, they went to the stews, the brothels that lined the outskirts of town, especially along the Thames in Southwark. There, beneath creaking signs and candle-lit windows, sex was bought and sold with brisk efficiency. and with it, disease passed silently from one body to another. Some brothels were well known, even licensed. The Bishop of Winchester, whose lands included Southwark, was said to benefit from the taxes paid by brothel keepers. The women who worked there were called Winchester geese. But they were not geese. They were women, poor, often young, sometimes trafficked, sometimes fleeing worse fates. They served men of every class, apprentices, merchants, nobles, even clergy. They lived in small, shared rooms. Their days were long, their nights longer, and they were blamed when things went wrong. If a man returned home diseased, it was her fault. If a marriage soured, it was her corruption. If a child was born ill, it was her sin. Never mind that the men sought them out, paid them, bragged about it in taverns. The women of the stews and of the streets bore the full burden of society's lust and its guilt. And when they fell ill, there was little mercy. Some tried to treat the pox. The most common cure was mercury. Yes, mercury. It was taken in many forms, rubbed on the skin as an ointment, boiled into steam baths, or ingested in small, dangerous doses. Patients would sweat profusely, salivate until they could barely swallow. Their gums bled. Their hair fell out. Some died from the treatment itself. Still, it was all they had. And so the pocky houses were filled with the sounds of suffering, groans, coughs, prayers, the sharp reek of metal and rot, the soft weeping of women whose beauty had faded in just weeks. And still, people returned to the brothels, because the pull of desire did not vanish. Even as the risks grew, even as the church condemned, even as doctors warned. The stews offered something people could not name: escape, relief, connection. And for the women who worked there, it was often the only path left. A girl turned out of her family's home for a scandal, a widow without income, a servant dismissed for resisting her master's hand. They arrived in Southwark with little more than a bundle of clothes and a prayer. Some made money, enough to buy ribbons, warm bread, even a little comfort. Some found brief love, a man who returned again and again, who brought apples and kindness. But most were used up quickly. A few years, maybe 5. By 30, many were cast aside. If they caught the pox, their chances vanished. Pimps wanted girls who looked clean, fresh, unmarked, and so the sick were left to rot in alleys, in poorhouses, in unmarked graves. But the disease did not stay in the stews. It travelled across bedsheets, across towns, across class lines. Wives caught it from husbands, mistresses from kings, midwives from infected mothers. Even children were born with it, blind, deaf, covered in sores. And through it all, shame remained. People whispered, pointed, lied. No one wanted to admit they had it. No one wanted to be seen entering the pocky wards. Even Henry VIII may have suffered from it, though records are vague and historians still debate. What we do know is this: syphilis was everywhere, and it ruined lives, and still people desired. Because the human body does not learn from fear alone. Even when burned, even when broken, it longs. And in Tudor England, where life was short, uncertain, and often brutal, those moments of closeness, however risky, were a kind of defiance. But not all sex work was in brothels. Some women worked alone, taking clients into alleyways or corners of inns. Some lived as single women, a polite term often used in records to describe women without husbands, and sometimes discreetly to describe those who sold sex. Others became courtesans, lovers of the rich. They were educated, elegant, skilled in conversation as well as bed. But they too were disposable. If they fell ill or bore a child or aged, they were replaced. And the cycle continued. Desire, risk, disease, shame, and yet desire. It did not fade. Even those who suffered still remembered. An old woman in a London hospital, her face pockmarked, might recall the warmth of a hand on her back one winter night. A man coughing blood in a wooden cot might think of a girl who once sang to him in a candlelit room. Because even sickness cannot erase tenderness entirely, and not every story ended in ruin. Some couples survived the pox. Some women left the stews and found quiet lives. Some men learned caution, not from sermons, but from sorrow. And so, beneath the fear, there was always something more. A flicker of connection, a trace of something softer. Even in disease, there was still humanity. So tonight, as we sit in the stillness, let's light a candle for them. The women who worked until their bodies broke, the men who carried guilt they couldn't name, the children born into pain, never knowing why, the lovers who risked it all for one more night of closeness. History forgets them, but we don't have to. We can remember, gently, quietly. We can hold their stories like folded letters, worn at the edges, but still legible. And we can learn not just from their mistakes, but from their longing. Because even in the face of disease, of judgment, of death, they still reached for each other. And perhaps that too is something sacred. Let's begin this next chapter not with loud declarations or scandalous stories, but with a breath, a pause, a shared glance in the quiet. Because the subject before us now is not found in official records. It lives instead in the margins, the smudged corners of court cases, the soft spaces between words in letters never meant to be read aloud. This chapter is about queer love in Tudor England, not the kind that was spoken openly, but the kind that survived in whispers. It's easy, in hindsight, to speak of law, to quote the statutes that criminalized sodomy, to point to the punishments, the fines, the imprisonment, even the gallows. But beneath all that noise there were lives, real lives, full of longing, confusion, fear, and love. And those stories, tender, trembling, unfinished, are what we hold now. Let us begin with a man, a tailor's apprentice in a quiet London parish. He is 19. His hands are calloused from work. He spends his days hemming sleeves, threading needles, measuring wool. But sometimes, when the shop is quiet, he glances toward the older journeyman at the far bench. That man, perhaps 25, never speaks much. But once, he handed the boy a scrap of fabric with a quiet smile. And since then, the apprentice has been waiting, hoping for another word, another smile. He doesn't know what it means, not yet, only that something inside him stirs. But he also knows what the priest says each week, that sodomy is a sin, that unnatural lust must be rooted out, that those who give in to such temptations will burn. So he says nothing, does nothing, only feels. Now, imagine a girl in the country, 17. She helps her mother with the laundry. Her hands are red from lye. Her back aches from lifting wet linen. But she smiles when the neighbor's daughter visits. That girl, bold, clever, always humming, once brushed her shoulder as they walked to the well. Just a brief touch, but enough. Later, alone in bed, the girl thinks of that moment. She does not have words for it. There are no books in her house that speak of women loving women, only Bibles, sermons, recipes. And yet, she knows. Something inside her feels like a flower turning to sun. She dreams of them walking hand in hand across the moor, sitting close, lying in the heather, watching the clouds move overhead. And she knows. It cannot be. because in Tudor England, same-sex desire, especially between men, was not only taboo, it was illegal. Under the Buggery Act of 1533, passed during Henry VIII's reign, sodomy was punishable by death. It was the first time English law had defined the act as a felony, and it sent a clear message. This kind of love was not just wrong, it was criminal. But the law was vague. It focused on penetration, on physical proof. And so many men and women lived in the spaces in between. They shared beds, hugged too long, wrote letters with careful affection, called each other dearest friend, and hoped no one noticed the way they looked at each other in silence, because there were no words. Not really. No gay, no lesbian, no bisexual, not as we know them today. Instead, there was confusion, denial, and deep, buried longing. Some tried to marry, to bury the feelings beneath duty. Others joined monasteries or convents, thinking solitude would cure them. And some gave in, found each other, touched, kissed, loved, and sometimes were caught. The records are sparse, but they exist. In 1550, 2 men were executed in London for sodomy. Their names, John Knight and Nicholas Udall. One was a schoolmaster, the other a young man of unknown trade. What passed between them, we do not know. Only that someone reported it, that they were tried, condemned, and hanged. In another case, a man named James Pratt and another, John Smith, were arrested after being found in a private room together. Their case was sensationalized, the stuff of gossip and horror. They were hanged in 1835, but their story began centuries earlier, echoing the fear that haunted queer people throughout history. These were the dangers, but there was also love. Hidden, yes, brief, often, but real. Some letters survive. Not many, but enough. One, from a young man to his close friend, reads, "I miss thee more than daylight, more than fire in winter. I would give up my bread if it meant a touch of thy hand again." It doesn't say more, it doesn't need to, because in every word there is longing, risk, truth, and we must remember, not all queer love was between men. Women too formed close, passionate bonds, shared beds, shared secrets. The church often dismissed such relationships as sisterly affection. It did not conceive of women having sex together, or if it did, it ignored it. But the women knew. They knew the way their hearts raced, the way they lingered, the way they dreamed of each other. And sometimes that love bloomed quietly for years. 2 spinsters living together, caring for the same hearth. 2 widows who never remarried, 2 maids who disappeared from the records, perhaps because they fled together to somewhere they could live in peace. We'll never know their full stories, but we can imagine, and imagination is sometimes the truest form of remembrance. Because queer lives in Tudor England were rarely recorded with care. More often, they were erased, mocked, punished. But in those blank spaces, something survived, not only fear, but tenderness. Let us walk now into a tavern on the edge of town. The fire crackles, the air smells of ale, smoke, and roasted onions. A man sits at a corner table. He watches another, broad-shouldered, loud, laughing with friends. He watches and his heart aches. He knows he must look away soon. Someone might notice. But for a moment he allows himself the dream that the man will turn, smile, walk over, that they will leave together under moonlight, that their hands might brush, that there might be a room somewhere with thick curtains and no questions, that for one night he might feel seen, even just for one night, and perhaps that happened, because for all the risk, all the law, all the shame, people still reached for each other. not just for sex, but for love, for belonging, for the warmth of another body that made the world feel less cold. There were secret places, hidden rooms, friendly innkeepers, sympathetic housemaids, churches where the confessional held more than guilt, where the priest perhaps looked the other way. And there were small rebellions, a wink, a coded phrase, a flower tucked into a sleeve. Some men wore coloured ribbons that meant nothing to most, but everything to those who knew. Some women wore each other's rings on chains, or used the same comb, or left notes in baskets of laundry. These were not loud acts, but they mattered, because in a world that told them they did not exist, they did. Quietly, bravely, even in the shadow of the noose, and sometimes, when caught, they still told the truth. "I loved him," one man was said to have whispered just before his execution, "and I do not regret it." That sentence was not recorded officially, but it was remembered, passed on, from ear to ear, from heart to heart, because it mattered, and it still does. So tonight, as we lie in the quiet, let's remember them. The tailor's apprentice, the country girl, the widows who lived as more than friends, the men who risked everything for a touch, the letters burned, the hands held in secret, the lives never fully lived, but still full of love. Queer love is not new. It did not begin with liberation. It has always been here, in sighs, in dreams, in pain, in joy, even in Tudor England, a place that made no room for them. Queer people carved out corners, built small shelters, found each other, and in doing so, survived. Their stories are not complete, but they are real. And tonight, by candlelight, we honor them, not as sinners, not as criminals, but as lovers, as dreamers, as people who dared, even in silence, to feel. And that is everything. Let us breathe now, slowly, and settle in for the final part of this story. We've wandered through Tudor bedrooms, lingered in the heavy air of church pews, watched steam rise from vinegar-warmed washcloths. We've walked with women who bled in silence, with lovers who hid their glances, with boys who never found the words for what they were feeling. Now we arrive at the end, not a dramatic conclusion, but a soft one, the kind that folds gently into the quiet. Because when we talk about sex in Tudor England, we are not really talking about lust or scandal or sin. We're talking about control, about expectation, about silence, and about all the people who were shaped and scarred and sometimes shattered by a world that never asked them what they wanted, only what they owed. A world where bodies weren't owned but loaned, to husbands, to God, to bloodlines. A world where pleasure was suspect, where desire was dangerous, and where love, if it didn't fit the script, was left to rot in the shadows. And yet that world was still made of people. Let's go back now to a small Tudor village. The church bell is ringing, a slow, heavy toll for a death. No one says much, but they walk in silence toward the graveyard. The woman being buried was 42. She had 7 children. Only 2 survived infancy. She died, most believe, from the last childbirth. Her husband stands at the foot of the grave. His hands tremble. He is not an unkind man. He works hard, prays daily, never raised his voice unless the fields went dry. But he never once asked her if she was tired, never once asked her if she wanted to bear again. Because it wasn't a question. Sex for him was not about cruelty, it was about routine, marriage, duty. He weeps now, but not loudly, just a soft, uneven breath as the earth is shoveled in. Somewhere in the village, a girl of 13 is getting ready for her betrothal. Her mother combs her hair. tells her what herbs to boil when her time comes. She listens, she says nothing, but in her stomach something twists. Because no one has asked her either. No one has asked if she wants to be touched, or when, or by whom. And so the silence passes on, like an heirloom, from one woman to the next, not spoken but felt. Now we walk into a merchant's house. The walls are lined with tapestries. The fire is well fed. A girl, 17, is writing a letter by candlelight. She writes to a friend, a girl she once lived with at a noble household. The letter is filled with small talk, embroidery patterns, household gossip, new recipes. But between the lines, something flickers. I miss your hands, the way they calmed my trembling, the way you hummed while braiding my hair. My mother says I must learn to care for my husband, but I would rather care for you. She doesn't sign her name. The letter is folded and hidden in the lining of a cloak, passed to a servant, and never spoken of again. It will never be answered, but it is real, because even in silence, love found ways to breathe. Let's go now into the royal court, a palace filled with velvet and danger. A lady-in-waiting stands at her window, watching the courtyard below. She has caught the king's eye. She knows what that means. She's been told it's an honor. Her mother smiled with pride. Her father said, "Do not fail us." But she feels nothing, or rather she feels dread, numbness, a kind of trembling that lives just behind her ribs. She does not want to be touched by him. She does not want to be another name in his long list. But there is no choice, and so she will smile, will bow, will lie beneath him and think of rain, of letters, of anything but the present. And in the morning, she will walk among the other ladies, pretending everything is fine. Because no one will ask her how it felt, only whether he was pleased. The legacy of sex in Tudor England is not written in romantic poems or perfumed letters. It's written in the quiet sobbing behind bed curtains, in the midwife's tired eyes after another stillbirth, in the bruises hidden by linen collars, in the girl who never touched another woman again, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd learned the cost of wanting. And yet, there is resilience here too, small rebellions. The woman who brewed her own contraceptive tea and told no one. The man who kept his love letters hidden behind the Psalms. The midwife who helped a girl escape to another village far from the man who claimed her. These acts were not loud. They were quiet, barely visible, but they were there, and they matter. Because they remind us that even when sex was wrapped in control, in pain, in punishment, people still found moments of choice, moments of softness, moments where they said, if only silently, "This part is mine." Let us now enter a chamber at the end of a long hallway. The shutters are drawn. A woman lies in bed. She is 60, a rarity in this world. She never married. She lives with her cousin, another unmarried woman. They've shared this house for 20 years. To the neighbors, they are odd. To the priest, a curiosity. But to each other, they are everything. They grow herbs, read aloud in the evenings, sit on the porch in springtime and listen to the birds. They sleep in separate rooms, but sometimes, on cold nights, one slips into the other's bed. No one asks questions, and they offer no answers, because they know what they are, even if no one else has a word for it. And in their silence, there is peace. Sex in Tudor England was rarely joyful, rarely free, but love somehow still survived. So what then is the legacy? What do we carry centuries later? Perhaps it is the silence, the way our ancestors were never taught to ask, to listen, to wonder what a partner might need. Perhaps it is the shame, passed on in glances, in jokes, in rules that made bodies something to hide. But perhaps, too, it is the resilience, the way people touched despite the risk, the way they reached again and again for something warmer than isolation. And perhaps that is what we honor most tonight. Not just the suffering, but the reaching, the candle lit after dark, the hand held beneath the table, the letter passed in secret, the voice that said, "I am still here," even when no one was listening. So as we close this final chapter, let's do so softly, not with judgment, not with pity, but with reverence for every woman who carried grief in her belly and still managed to sing, for every man who looked at another with longing and survived the shame, for every couple who found comfort in a world that tried to deny it, for every queer love that bloomed even in winter, for every act of care, of courage, of connection. These stories are not loud, but they are true. And in the end, truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be heard, even now, even here, even in sleep.